I want to jump into our morning executive keynote panel with three really esteemed and smart people and great civic leaders. So I want to welcome to the stage Frank Blethen, publisher of the Seattle Times, Renee Radcliff Sinclair, the president of TVW, and Senator Jamie Pedersen, the chairman of the Law and Justice Committee. Let's welcome them to the stage with a round of applause. Very good. Well, thank you. So when we had our community panel conversation, Renee, you were there for that. The most sort of galvanizing topic that people wanted to hear about was not education, it wasn't Medicaid, it wasn't the elections, it was this issue of transparency and the Public Records Act in the 2019 legislative session. So I want to start, Senator, and because I'm going to call him Frank and I'm going to call her Jamie, or Renee, I'm going to call you Jamie, if you don't mind. Jamie, why don't you walk us through first? Tell us about your thoughts, or perhaps your caucus's thoughts, but I think you'll represent yourself rather than the caucus, but you tell us, about the Public Records Act, about transparency, and where we are in this process. Why do we need to modernize? Why does the legislature need to modernize and address the Public Records Act from where you sit?
Thank you for having me. So let me be clear to begin with that I have never sat on the state government committee. This issue is one that I have touched only indirectly during the 12 years that I've served in the legislature. And so last year was really a baptism by fire for me in thinking about this issue of transparency in the legislature. You know, I had been aware as one of the lawyers in the caucus and the legislature that there was a lawsuit going on, and frankly didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it other than with some academic interest about what does agency mean, and the question of what the voters might have been thinking about now 45 years ago, when they passed the original initiative that led to the creation of the Public Records Act. The experience of last year, where we had a wonderful session in so many ways, I think dramatic progress on a whole series of issues that are important to a lot of us, and then this absolutely catastrophic failure, both of our process and of the substance, I think led a lot of us, whether we were busy campaigning this summer or not, to think more deeply about this issue than we had thought. And I will say that for myself, I have become a strong convert to the idea that regardless of what the Public Records Act says or what the voters meant when they passed the original initiative, we need to be owning the task of bringing the legislature into the modern era and opening it up to the full extent possible without compromising our ability to get our basic work done. Yeah. So I think that everything from our calendars to our emails to the records inside the legislature are going to wind up being public. I think that we're going to have court review of questions about that. I think we have the job to build out a robust public records function within the legislature to make sure that we can respond to those requests. And I do think that there's some careful thought that we have to do both about the transition provisions and about how to do this in a way that doesn't cause us to become completely dysfunctional and unable to pass budgets and bills. So that's the challenge that's ahead of us. Senator Billig, our new majority leader, asked me to take the lead on this issue for our caucus, and I'm looking forward to working with stakeholders from all the sides, doing what our process really, I think, generally does very well when we follow it, trying to work with all the people who have perspectives on this issue to get us to that new place where the legislature does business in a transparent way.
I would be remiss if I didn't tell folks that we invited every elected official that serves on the Public Records Task Force. I believe none of them responded to this invitation. We invited a series of other folks, both Democratic and Republican members. None of them wanted to participate. So I appreciate that you are here and willing to talk about this and engage. It means a lot, I think, to this audience.
Even if I was the 146th choice.
You know you weren't the 146th choice. We know we had you slotted someplace else, and I appreciate your participation. Let me sort of just follow up with that for a second, Jamie. When I know you're not on the task force, but the task force themselves it feels like they continue to sort of wrestle with this basic question of whether the Public Records Act even needs to be modified. That there were voices in the legislature that the legislative appointees to that task force often would not agree to basic language that would solidify the starting point is the existing PRA. Other members, non-legislators, were pushing to start at that point. What do you think the position might be? I know it's not fully fleshed out yet, but is that too hard of a starting place to start with the existing PRA and add select exemptions? Is that too narrow, or do you think that we need to be more realistic or ambitious about modernizing the 45 or 40-year-old act?
Let me take you into a completely different area and give you what I think is a pretty good analogy. We have a terrible tax system. It's broken really badly. It's by almost anybody's measure the most regressive tax system in the entire country. And it doesn't produce the revenue that we need to do the basic kinds of investments that we need to do in the state, and it isn't fair. In the sense that people who are lower income pay a lot more of a lot greater share of their income to support the state and local taxes than people who make a lot more money. One of the tremendous problems that we have in our state is that the companies that ought to be taking the lead on tax reform and really pushing the legislature to do what it should do in terms of modernizing a broken 85-year-old system, have over time written themselves out of the tax code. And so they don't have a huge stake in the brokenness that is the tax system. I think we have a similar problem with the Public Records Act, and part of the reason that the legislature over time has not gotten in and helped adjust, modernize the Public Records Act is that the legislature has thought that it isn't subject to the Public Records Act. It doesn't concern it directly, it's too hot to touch, and so the easiest thing is just to leave it exactly the way that it is. And I think it's probably certain that there are improvements that could be made that would improve transparency and reduce the cost of compliance. But we haven't been invested in that because we haven't been subject to it. I think that in some ways the most important thing is to make it one Public Records Act to which we are subject, since we write the rules and have the capacity to update it. Once we feel what it's like to be subject to it, I suspect that there will be a lot more sympathy to the concerns of county and local elected officials who bring us problems from time to time.
So you think one of the more important things to do is to end sort of this legislative carve-out where where the legislature is treated differently than other public jurisdictions like cities and counties? Did I hear you right?
Well, I think there's a intellectual or academic question about whether the legislature is subject. The Act talks about agencies. We are not an agency, we are a branch. Mm-hmm. From a political perspective, I think that doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. We need to be subject to the Public Records Act. So there's some rewriting to make sure that it applies to the branch of the legislature. But other than that, I think we mostly need to be subject to the same set of rules. Yeah. And to the extent that we find that those are problematic or need to be updated, then we're going to change the rules for everybody. Yeah. I'm not sure that there needs to be a large set of carve-outs that are specific to the legislature.
Frank, what do you make of what you've heard from Jamie? It sounds like, and I think many members have evolved in their thinking on both sides of the aisle since the legislative session last year in 2018. What do you make of how that session played out, how the task force has done its work in the interim, and what you might expect from the 2019 session on this topic?
Well, I guess first of all, it was really interesting hearing Senator Pedersen describe this, and the fact that he is not very steep like most of the legislature in the law, and the people in the task force who supposedly have gotten more steep don't want to go in the public and talk about it. It strikes me that Senator Pedersen is going to end up becoming a real advocate for keeping the Public Records Act intact and having the legislature comply. Because at the end of the day, once you really understand the law and how it's been administered since 1972, you realize it doesn't need modification. There's an occasional technical thing, there's an occasional exception, but the fact of the matter is, since 1972, every other level of government in this state, including the governor's office, have complied with it. The only exception has been the legislature, and there is nothing in the law that justifies them excluding themselves. There have been 500, there are already 500 exceptions on the books, which basically have come about through discussions when some kind of an issue has come up, and through negotiations it's been, and I don't even think many of them have been very controversial. I think it's been pretty well recognized by legislative bodies as well as the media, where some exceptions were needed. Those 500 exceptions cover an awful lot of issues. One of the things we learned in this process is most of the legislatures aren't familiar with the law, nor are they even familiar. We have people in the task force talking about a need for a change in the law when there's already existing exemptions that cover it, but they didn't know that. So maybe the silver lining in all of this is going to be a renewed interest by the legislature in an issue which the public is just overwhelmingly adamant about. The question I've always had is, well, why have we, the media, stood aside for a decade plus while the legislature has treated this very cavalierly and not produced records, which everybody else has to? And it's instructive that this really came to a head this year when there are several records being withheld, but the primary one had to do with sexual harassment and Me Too. And it wasn't until that came up that all of a sudden we had this attempt to, well, what happened was the Seattle Times, AP, and several other media, finally, we'd had it, we sued the legislature for those records. The legislature fought that. They refused to go to their attorney general, which is really peculiar. One can only speculate they didn't think they were going to get the opinion from him that they would want. And anybody who knows this arena probably would agree with that. So at great expense to the public, they went out and hired expensive attorneys, and they sought a predetermined opinion that was going to allow them to, to fight the suit. It went to Superior Court, Thurston County, I think, and they lost. They got it handed to them. They lost it big time. Then they're going to appeal it to the Supreme Court. I think the speculation by anybody who's watching this knows that believes that the Supreme Court will uphold the media on this and not the legislature. So the task force suddenly pops up as sort of a diversion or something to, I've heard speculation, to try to get some kind of a law or modification passed so that the appeal and the suit would become moot. I don't know if that's even possible. In that process, of course, the newspapers then started editorializing. I've never seen, in 40 years of doing this, I've never seen this kind of a public interest and a public reaction. And it's certainly the first time in my career that 13 of the state's biggest newspapers all ran front page editorials on it. Governor got over 20,000 responses.
So let me ask you about that, but by preface, let me say, I, like many, have been an observer of the Seattle Times and of media in general over these last few years and decades, and watched what appeared to be some significant struggles at the Seattle Times, like many outlets. And it looks like you have done really tremendous work turning things around, whereas papers like the Oregonian have all but shuttered. It seems like the Seattle Times is starting to grow and doing some very interesting, important work. I just want to commend you for that. I think that in this vein of civics and civic dialogue, somebody said, and I will paraphrase poorly, that the Seattle Times does more for our civic discussion in one daily edition than certainly anything that we could do over the course of a year. And I know people don't always give you the credit that you deserve, and that's appropriate maybe because the press and policymakers have a naturally contentious relationship, but I just think it merits me or somebody saying thank you for what you're doing for
I appreciate that. Thank you.
With that preface, you're a private citizen, you're an owner of your own company and run your own company. You have every right to be an advocate, as much as anybody else. Putting the editorial on the front page of the paper in 2018, as you referenced, was, I believe, the first time that has happened at the Seattle Times, in at least in your tenure, and maybe 100 years, if I recall correctly. What kind of advocacy do you want to see newspapers provide in 2019? I know it's not the natural position of the media to advocate for some of these things, but it was the position in 2018. Do you expect to have more of an advocacy role as a newspaper or media community in 2019?
Are you referring to public records or a broader agenda?
Public records, unless you have a broader agenda that you'd like to illuminate.
We don't have enough time.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you saw that it was really organic what happened with the 13 newspapers all ended up coordinating this. It was just our editorial page editor, Kate Riley, when we knew we were going to do an editorial and that we took this so seriously that it was going to be a front page editorial. She called her peers around the state just to start giving them a heads up. And it just it was organic. They all said, we want in, and they all did their own versions of it. It is so fundamental to what we do. And it is, well, I appreciate your comments because it's something that has been lost. 80% of newspapers, media, TV, radio in our country today are owned by financial conglomerates and hedge funds. They're disinvesting in journalism right and left. We happen to have a state where, we're one of only 5 private local metros left in America, not surprisingly doing some of the best journalism, because that's what we do. And the openness, the transparency of government is absolutely paramount to what we do. Mm-hmm. I was schooled on this the first day I walked into work at the Seattle Times 50 years ago. It is so basic. You look at the loss of all the newspaper voices, even in our state, where over half the papers now are owned by out-of-staters who are significantly disinvesting in them as we speak. There's just very few voices left out there. Mm-hmm. And part of what happens is, I think people start living in a bubble. And I sympathize with the tough job legislators have. They go down to Olympia and they're dealing with the same staff that's down there all the time. They're talking to each other, either talking to lobbyists. It's easy to get caught up in a bubble and to sort of forget that, this is really critical, this openness in government. And when you talk about the problems with institutional credibility, mm-hmm. A lot of institutional credibility has to do with the fact that we've lost responsible ownership of so much of our media, and where we have it left, we are getting the voices that we need, but we're sort of few and far between.
And so, just so I can understand, do you expect that you guys will be running additional front page editorials or pushing one way or the other on any Public Records Act legislation?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question. It all depends on what happens going forward.
Yeah.
We will continue to write editorials. In fact, I think we're going to have one coming this Sunday. And they will be as forceful as we can. I don't know if they'll actually make the front page. But I tell you what the question that we have, which I think everybody should have, why did this come up when the records being withheld had to do with how sexual harassment's being handled in Olympia and Me Too? You know, when we see that in government, it doesn't matter if it's city government, the legislature, wherever, the first thing we have to ask ourselves as journalists is, what are they trying to hide from the people?
Yeah.
There's something here that they don't. So I think what they've done is they probably created a bigger story, which may not be a front page editorial story, but could well be a front page news stories when we finally find out what's in those records that somebody doesn't want us to know.
So Renee, you've been an elected official, a legislator in that environment. You've been a lobbyist with a lot of big name entities and operated in a number of different states, and now you run, as president of TVW, run a civic-minded public affairs network. Where do you see the middle ground here, if any? Like, where is, fix it for us? What is the pathway forward on something like this?
Oh boy, where do I start? So let's start with a little bit of history. And this is an odd place for me to be because my whole life is about transparency, and I really believe in the importance of transparency in government. And yet I am very sympathetic to the position in which the legislature finds itself. Historically, prior to the Freedom of Information Act, on which the 1972 initiative that created the Public Records Act is really based, legislative bodies were their own police force in regard to the release of records. And once the Freedom of Information Act passed, that changed a little bit and things were far more open. And then the purpose of the 1972 initiative really seemed to be shedding light on who is interested and having an impact on the legislation that's moving forward. You have the piece about lobbyists reporting who they're being paid by. You have the piece about candidates and public officials reporting where their financial interests lie. You have the piece about candidates reporting and campaigns reporting, even initiative campaigns reporting where their finances are coming from. And those pieces of the act are working fairly well. Washington State has one of the most open systems for reporting those kinds of things in the country. And the interesting place that we find ourselves is on the release of agency information. And I absolutely agree with you, Jamie, that the legislature is not an agency. It is a co-equal branch of government. And as such, I think the legislature feels some stress around the issue of appeal. I think appeal is very important. There needs to be a system of appeal, but I think judicial appeal maybe rubs them a little wrong because is one equal branch a little less equal than another? And I think that's something that the legislature has to struggle with. Frank brought up the fact that the lawsuit was really spurred by the Me Too movement and some disciplinary action that took place in the legislature. In my mind, disciplinary action does not fall under that category of the core mission of one of the three branches of government and should have been released. That's hard for me to say. I know it would have been hard sitting as a legislator to know that those kinds of records are free and public. But I think there is middle ground. And I think the courts did an interesting thing. The judicial system did an interesting thing in that they wrote themselves out of the act through their rules. And the legislature had the same option. The legislature chose to start amending the Public Records Act, and I know we did so in 1995, and they did it again, creating some definitions in the early 2000s, 2002, 2003 timeframe. And I think the middle ground is the legislature, I think they understand it now, but the legislature has had the perception of not being transparent. Whether or not that's deserved or not, that is the perception. It's what people believe. And so if I were a sitting legislator today, I know my office would be doing everything it could do to comply with the spirit of the act, and I'd be encouraging my colleagues to do the same thing. I have often thought how I would have voted on that bill. And because of my life experience that I came to the legislature with, I probably would have voted no, but it would have been tough because I saw all those very personal, heart-wrenching stories that come through, which I don't think the press is even interested in seeing. I think the press is interested in something completely different, and we need to keep the conversation on history and the role of the three branches of government and their core mission, their core foundation of their work, and then what the press really needs to do their job in holding elected officials accountable.
Let me say thank you to TVW for broadcasting these keynotes in partnership with us. I appreciate it very much.
By the way, the one cable station that you are safe to watch. So.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Let me ask sort of a related question, Renee, from your perspective that gets some discussion, but which is seems like it's a little bit off the table in practice, if not in principle. And that is about the caucus meetings and any documents that might be produced to support caucus meetings that are not just in practice private and confidential, but all members of all four caucuses are very good at keeping their mouths shut about what goes on inside the caucus meeting. Do you think that a public record is a public record? And that if it's a public branch or agency produces a public document, even if it's related to strategy, even if it's within the caucus room, do you think a public record is a public record, or do you think that there should be some carve out for those kinds of things?
So I really think we have to go back to the Constitution and three equal branches of government. And I think caucus meetings, I think deliberations between 2 or 3 legislators are private conversations. Sometimes documents are produced, sometimes not. But the issue is, does the public records request touch on that core mission of that 1/3 of government? And if it does not, then I think that's public game. If it does, then I think the public records request should go to that body, and that body then make the decision. And as I said earlier, there does need to be an appeals process. Whether or not that appeals process is with the judiciary, which once again, one of 3 equal branches of government, and you can't have equal branches of government and have one providing oversight on the other. Now, the judiciary provides oversight over legislation all day long, but not over the body of the legislature, and that's where the difference arises. The judiciary chose to write their own rules.
Mm-hmm. So, Jamie, I want to go back to this question of why the legislature is different from a city or county. I recognize as a matter of law that cities are endowed by the state and creations of the state, and so this idea of a separate branch, i.e. a city council, one might argue that a city council is not a separate branch of government. I think city council members would disagree. I think the AWC would disagree. But I can understand the logic of saying that that happens within the creation and purview of the state. Counties precede or coincide, have a sovereignty with the state. And setting aside charter counties for a minute, which I can understand, again, might even be considered complicated. A 3-person commission, a county commission, those 3 members are still subject to all of the same rules related to texts, emails, personal or private, if they are either in the spirit or practice of serving government or employing or serving within their office. So whether you're a co-equal branch at a city council or a fully sort of sovereign and state-created institution like a county commission, those charter-based entities, those state creation entities, and those constitutional entities all serve under the same PRA regardless of their branch or agency endowment. Wouldn't that sort of sweeping inclusion undermine the co-equal branch argument that Renee lays out, that because it's a separate branch, it should be treated differently, when the PRA applies to all branches and all models of creation for counties and cities and other public jurisdictions?
Well, first of all, I guess I want to go all the way back to what Frank said about the newspapers having won decisively in the court. In fact, the newspapers appealed, just like the legislature appealed, because Judge Lanise found that the legislature is a separate branch of government, not an agency, and the records that are maintained by the branch, by the chief clerk of the House of Representatives and by the Secretary of the Senate, are not subject to public disclosure. They are not public records for purposes of the Public Records Act. Now, do I think that's the right outcome? I think it may be the legally correct outcome, but as I said before, I think that's not a politically tenable outcome. We need to figure out how to make the branch live in a world that expects transparency about how we do our business. So I get the question that, yeah, I mean, I can make a good legal argument to you about why counties and cities and ditch districts and everything else that we have are agencies of the state, and the only thing that is the three-branch government is the state legislature, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And the judicial branch, by the way, that we have no question that executive branch agencies are agencies and they're subject to the Public Records Act. The judicial branch already wrote itself out of the Public Records Act and decided that it didn't apply to the judicial branch. Okay, so it made its own rules, and those have been in effect for 30 years, and they're the ones who get to decide any challenges to that. So I think you can see where that's going to head. So, you know, we're down to the legislature. From my perspective, the important question isn't so much what did the initiative mean, or why should the legislature be different? It's what are we charged to do under the Constitution? We're charged to make laws for the state. We're charged to adopt budgets for the state, right? And then we have a bunch of specific responsibilities like funding education. Well, from my perspective, how can we do that work in a way that's as transparent as possible? We need to think about what are the absolute things that would impair our ability to get to 50 votes and 25 votes and send stuff to the governor for signature, right? And I think to Renee's point, there is a piece about the legislature's deliberative process that is a core constitutional question. My ability to bounce ideas off of staff without worrying that that's going to wind up in the newspaper is basic to my ability to come up with ideas. Now, all of those ideas are going to be debated in committee, on the floor, in open session, right? And TVW is going to cover it, and everybody's going to be able to see exactly what's going on. And by the way, along the path, nonpartisan staff will write all sorts of bill analyses and reports. Those are all out on the website for everybody to see. People can come and testify. We don't do bills without having public hearings. So that's the process that I think we shortcut with this bill, ironically, that ought to help us generally get through this. But when you get down to the question of how do you build the ideas, and then how do you build the coalitions of people internally to try to get to the point where you unveil a proposal or where you pass a bill and then have that debate out in the open, I think it would be very hard if we knew that every email exchange or text exchange between a member and staff or between members was potentially going to be in the media. It would be very hard to do our core constitutional job.
He did a beautiful job of explaining the deliberative process and how difficult it is to capture. I served in the legislature when the majority party decided that it would be a good idea to have conference committees meet in public and have those processes be open. In theory, that's a beautiful idea. In practice, it didn't work so well. Nothing happened at those conference committee meetings. Everything happened behind closed doors. And I think the nature of human beings and the deliberative process is things go back and forth very quickly, and you take an idea and you sleep on it overnight, and you come back the next morning and you run into somebody that you need to talk to about it. And those are the kinds of conversations that move us closer to resolution on really important issues. And if those conversations, if people are afraid to have those conversations, the process fails.
Yeah. So Frank, let me sort of paraphrase some of this, or rather, let me paraphrase some of the argument that I heard that I think might be reflected in some of this, which is government will work better and get more done if you can allow people to be people and have conversations. As soon as you turn on the cameras, or as soon as you make records public, it fundamentally alters the way government works, and not necessarily for the better. In fact, many times it makes it more, people grandstand, they play to the cameras, they play for the headlines, and they don't play to moving policy forward. Do you think that's relevant to this discussion?
Yeah, I think it's relevant in that it's a red herring. We have a saying in the shop, darkness and secrecy only serve special interests and undermines our citizens' ability to self-govern. You know, if you want bad government, maximize the secrecy and to minimize the transparency. I'm not a lawyer. I think Jamie's probably absolutely right on the appeal thing he explained. But in trying to get up to speed on this a little bit, you know, I did get immersed in the deliberative process, which is something I had not really been exposed to before. And, you know, it made me feel good because as I understand the deliberative process, during that process, there is the ability to keep those records private. But once a decision is made, then the people have a right to know how that decision was made. Now, do public officials get around by that by having discussions which they don't record or write down? Yeah, you know, probably they do. But you know, so there is that respect for, and I get that deliberative process. But I also get it that the people need to know why legislation was made. You know, whatever the deliberative process was around this piece of legislation that violated all the normal procedures and public meetings and so on that would have taken place. Whatever drove that, now, you know, as going back to what I said earlier, that's really got us curious. It's really got me curious because somebody, rightly or wrongly, somebody is trying to hide something. And you know, it'd be really nice to get the records and find out that was wrong, that, you know, and that there is a deliberative process that gives the people a comfort that their government is really thinking through things the way they should and thinking about the public in that process, or not.
Yeah.
You know, one way or the other, we should know.
So in our last few minutes, I want to switch gears a little bit and give each of you a final question that I'll ask of all of you, which is, again, switching gears. When we are back here on stage a year from now, give us one big prediction, Frank, about our politics in Washington State. One big thing that will happen politically between now and this conference next year, and we'll hold you to it because it's going to be on TVW. I'll start with you, sir.
Can I go last?
You can, but you don't get to. You get to go first.
One big one. That we'll spend so much time fighting about new taxes that we won't pay enough attention to how we're spending the existing money, and we put a lot of money in the system. And I fear that reforms and additional spending needed in education is going to get the short stick. There are some other priorities I think will get the short stick too, but you know, we're making progress, but we still have a K-12 system and you know, getting kids work ready, that is broken and is one of the biggest creations of fault lines in our state.
Good. Renee, big idea, prediction for us a year from now? that we'll be talking about?
3. I'll make them fast. I think the conversation that's been spurred by the lawsuit brought by the media is going to make every single legislator far more aware of the spirit of the Public Records Act. And it's my desire and it's my hope that they will make their office as compliant with the spirit of that as they possibly can, based on their own volition, not by the results of a lawsuit. That's number 1. Number 2, it is going to be a year, I think, in which we're talking a lot about taxes. I don't know what the outcome will be, but I think we'll be talking a lot about it. And I think I'm starting to feel like there might be some sort of resolution to the Western State Hospital situation during the 2019 legislative session.
Wow, that's bold. Jamie?
We are going to get done on time, and we're going to adopt all 3 of our budgets before then. I predict that Frank is not correct, that we are going to continue to work on public education. I'm happy to be spending my lunch today at Seattle Public Schools headquarters with most of the other Seattle delegation, and we're going to be talking about special ed funding, and we're talking about school construction funding. Those things are not going away from the agenda. We know that we need to work on housing and homelessness. We need to work on the behavioral health system. And we got to talk about transportation and getting a package done that permits us to rebuild the I-5 bridge, among other priorities. So we are not losing track of that in the midst of everything else. And I'm skeptical that we're going to spend all of our time talking about taxes. Those are really a means to an end, which is making the investments that we need to for our people. So I think most of the conversation is going to be on what those needs are and our continuing need to be as careful as we can to spend the money in the best way that we can.
Very good. Senator Jamie Pedersen, Chairman of the Senate Law and Justice Committee, Renee Radcliff, President of TVW, and Frank Blethen, publisher, not yet emeritus, still publisher active of the Seattle Times. Thank you all for being here. Let's give them a round of applause.